Welcome to Real Chat with Kat, the podcast that's all about real conversations for real transformation. I'm your host, Kat Polsinelli, professional speaker, MC, and best-selling international author. Here, we tackle the tough stuff, the mud that we all have found ourselves in. We talk about the pivots, the challenges, and the victories that shape our lives and our businesses. From overcoming trauma and finding your voice to navigating life's unexpected twists, we get raw, honest, and open. You'll hear from inspiring guests who share their stories of resilience, healing, and growth. Whether it's breaking through emotional abuse, embracing self-worth, or thriving in entrepreneurship, you'll find connection, empowerment, and the tools to keep you moving forward. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and get ready for stories that hit home and conversations that make a difference. Let's get real together. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of Real Chat with Kat. I am so excited to have you here with us today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to intake some good information, and thank you to Liz Morrison for joining me today. I'm super excited to have you here.
I am so thrilled to be here, Kat. Thank you so much for having me.
Yay! I'm so excited. So just to give you guys a little bit of backstory, if you've been following me, so I went to this a 2-day public event called Heroic Public Speaking. It was an amazing event, and I met some amazing people. If you guys have heard, Troy's already been on here, and we talked a little bit about that as well. So Liz was another one of those amazing people that I got to connect with and chat with afterwards and everything, and I loved her energy. So I'm super excited to have her as a part of the podcast today so that we can dive into some storytelling and all of the things and components that go along with that. So Liz, do us a favor then and tell everybody who you are and what it is that you do.
Yes, absolutely. I call this my high story, which is basically your history, but also the story that you tell when you introduce yourself. So hello, everyone. My name is Liz Morrison, and I am a story coach and consultant. So, for 15 plus years earlier in my career, I was a content creator and producer, worked for companies like Airbnb or on the Obama campaign, even started my career working in reality television. Maybe we'll talk about the summer I worked on a Bravo dating show. I don't know. We'll find out. And, it was a dream career. I got to really specialize in helping everyday people use their personal stories to create some change in this world, from finding love on a dating show to electing a president to protecting home sharing and supporting healthy travel. And I just met incredible folks through that work as a producer and content creator. But then 2020, we all know what happened in 2020, global pandemic, not super great for a global travel company. And that was when I got laid off. And it was so hard. And I'm sure we'll go into this story in more detail a little later. But in that moment, I had to start looking at my own stories for the first time after 15 years of telling other people's stories to figure out what the heck I wanted to do next. And in looking back through my own stories, real patterns and themes emerged right quick about what I love to do, helping people use their stories to create greater change in their world or in the world. And I learned the things that I didn't like to do, which was sort of corporate bureaucracy and playing that game. And so that revelation set me off on this path to become a story coach. So now I work with ambitious professionals and, innovative teams who are looking to not only strengthen their innate skill of storytelling, but use storytelling to help them understand where they've been, where they are right now in this present moment, and most importantly, where they want to go next. So once we have that vision of the story of the future they want to create, we can work backwards and make that a reality.
Oh, I love this. Bravo TV. Ew.
Yeah.
We have to ask some questions.
Yes, absolutely.
But I love storytelling because I think that a lot of people, when they hear it, they immediately think like, oh, we're talking about not necessarily storytelling that like you're telling to your friends, but it's like, your entrepreneurial journey or who it
Hmm.
is that you're talking with over here, or if you're a speaker, right? Speaker, that
Yep.
storytelling
Hmm.
tends to come into speaking a lot. But there are so many ways that we are telling
Hmm.
stories all the time. And
Yeah.
especially in a corporate environment, or if you're working
Hmm.
with a team, knowing how to not only articulate what it is that you're wanting to say, but also having the ability to storytell and relate
Hmm.
and kind of mix that in, I feel like is going to make your message go a lot further
A lot further.
than it
Yeah.
would than just the what's the old way that people do it, right? The like
Hmm.
straight faced, I am professional,
Right.
which I am
Oh
terrible at
God.
doing.
Yeah. Well, there's so much science behind that actually, and why, by some studies, we remember stories more than 22 times more than we remember facts alone. And
Mm,
there's some powerful science behind why that is and what goes on in our brain when we hear a story, right? We are activating so many different parts of our brain when we hear or we share a story. And that's what makes it so much more memorable, visceral, and connected in a way that just sort of information or facts alone doesn't quite do the trick there. And I find that stuff fascinating. And I think the more that we can understand what goes on internally and the stories that shape us internally, we can then share those stories out much more effectively externally and use
mm.
them to help us achieve whatever it is that we're trying to achieve.
I love that. And I've
Mhm.
heard this before too recently that, that it is very different the way that when we incorporate storytelling into any of the things that we're doing, how much more that we're able to actually
Mhm.
intake, which, you think about in today's world, we're kind of like in overload anyway with all the
Mhm.
information that we're being fed. But I can totally agree with you because I can think of going to college classes forever ago,
Mhm.
and thinking about like listening to the statistics and
Mhm.
the fact, blah 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 blah. You find
Yeah.
yourself falling asleep. You don't even mean to, even if it's something that
Right.
you're really into, like you're really
Mhm.
fascinated by, right? But it was the pieces where we were sharing case studies and things
Mhm.
like that, right? Where you're kind of incorporating people's stories into that are super helpful. Even coming out of my abusive relationship, I had a really
Mhm.
hard time understanding all the things that I'd been through and like what it all meant and how to relate to it. But one of the first books that I picked up, which is called Codependency No More, the
Mhm.
main pieces and components in that book are reflections and stories that other
Yeah.
people shared. And then from that, they break
Mhm.
down and explain like how this is codependency and what this means behind like the
Mhm.
other pieces behind it. And I will
Yeah.
say that that was probably the very first book that like was a wake up call. And I was like, oh,
Oh, not me. I'm
maybe,
not alone.
maybe
Yeah.
I am codependent. That's a weird word.
Yeah.
Especially when you see your person as a very
Uh,
independent person. But it's
yeah.
really
Yeah.
interesting because I feel like the books that I am drawn to tend
Hmm.
to have more of that. Brene Brown is one of my favorite
Oh,
people.
she's
Her
incredible. Yeah.
storytelling in her
Hmm.
in her books or in the speeches that she
Hmm.
gives is phenomenal. And
Yeah.
it really does kind of wrap in all of the pieces that she's trying to get to. So she's
Mhm.
one of my absolute favorites, but I do find myself drawn to books that are more like that, where there's actual living proof that you
Right.
can then relate back to what it is you're trying to get someone
Right.
to understand.
Well, one of my main storytelling principles, Kat, is that sharing your story is such a gift. It is such a gift because you never know who needs to hear your story. I know
Mm,
what you just expressed is a perfect example of this, right? Where you were feeling alone and isolated in your experience. And then all of a sudden, when people shared their story, who were brave enough to share their story, it all of a sudden you were like, oh, what I heard you express was like, I'm not alone. Actually, ooh, maybe I need to like look at what's going on a little differently because it sounded like you related to these stories that you shared. And for me,
hmm
that's one of the reasons I'm such a big proponent of taking a time out, a pause from our busy, crazy lives to do this personal story reflection. Because stories are how we make meaning of the world, how we make meaning of our world and the greater world. Because I mean, literally, we've evolved to be storytelling creatures. It's like an evolutionary thing in our brain. And we are just so busy and going at a million miles an hour all the time. And we're constantly like wrapping ourselves in other people's stories. I don't know about you, but like I go down a TikTok binge here or there, Instagram binge, right? And like it's sort of fun to like clear the brain and get those little dopamine hits. But it doesn't allow us all the time to stop and create the space that we need to look inward, to understand that we have so much wisdom, so many lessons within us that truly help us understand when we take a pause where we want to go next in this world or what is maybe not working. When
Mm-hmm.
I talk about how we shape an effective story, the first part of any effective story is the context. You set the scene, you set the world, what's going on in your life right now, and what are some patterns that exist in your world that maybe are not working great for you right now. And then something happens, right? The catalyst moment happens in your story, and something breaks a pattern. And that breaking of the pattern is the thing that sets you off on this journey, right? So, what you just talked about reading this book, perhaps that was a catalyst moment for you where you were in a pattern. All of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden, your perspective had opened a little bit, broke you open so you could see that pattern, and then it set you on this journey, right? To come out much better on the other side. And that's the power of doing this story work is being able to give ourselves space to see the patterns in our life that may or may not be working so that we can consciously choose what we want to do next.
Ooh, okay. So this is a really
Mhm.
interesting twist, and I am so
Yeah.
excited about this
Yeah.
because, again, when we think about
Uh-huh.
storytelling, we're usually talking about somewhere in business or, speaking and things like
Mhm.
that. And what you are also talking about as well is how retelling your own stories
Mhm.
and going back through basically, right, your past, the things that you've
Mhm.
been through, and revisiting it in a completely different space,
Yeah.
in a conscious space, you
Mhm.
are able to then look at, if you choose,
Mhm.
to see, okay, what was I doing then? What
Yep.
happened over these years or those couple of months when those things happen?
Mhm.
And then do I want to continue down that path? And this is a really interesting idea. If you think about it, I equate this to when I first was told to journal,
Yeah.
which I was like, that is absolutely ridiculous. I don't want to
No,
write
thank
Dear
you.
Diary. No,
Yeah.
thank you. But when I thought about journaling in a way where
Mhm.
I just let go and just
Mhm.
wrote the things that came out or wrote down the things that I had been through,
Mhm.
I noticed that different things came up when I was
Mhm.
writing it or when I was like my husband. One of the things that really helped me heal was anytime that I had a triggering moment or I had something that
Mhm.
came up from the past that kind of like stopped me in my tracks. What I would make myself do, and I now do on a regular basis,
Mhm.
is I would tell him, like, hey, I need to tell you something. It has nothing to do with you, but I need to get it out. And what was interesting about that is as I was sharing those moments or that
Mhm.
story that was connected to why it is
Mhm.
that this just happened, right? It allowed me to see it from almost like a third party,
Mhm.
right? From a
Yep.
completely different perspective.
Mhm.
And then at the same time, you're also shifting the neurons
Mhm.
within the brain in regards to
Mhm.
what the brain believes, what
Right?
the brain feels, what the brain
Yep.
associates with, and then
Mhm.
how you want to drive the brain forward in the next
Mhm.
direction, which for me was super important because after going through so many years of being stuck in somebody else's world, there
Mhm.
was a lot of unraveling that needed to be done. But because the brain was so set in stone of what it believed in, I
Mhm.
really had to be able to tell those stories to my husband to be able to see it from an outside perspective and then be like,
Wait,
okay, I see why I
actually,
said that, right? I don't
yeah.
agree with that anymore. No,
Mhm.
that doesn't work. But it's really
Mhm.
interesting how you're talking about this storytelling and how it can really shift the way that you decide to do things in your life. And I haven't really thought about it
Mhm.
that way about breaking the
Yeah.
patterns and stuff. Yet I go back to my old stories
Totally. All
all
the
the
time.
time.
Yeah.
So,
No, and that's the thing. I find a lot of my clients come to me, my one-on-one clients or my corporate clients, they come to me because they're like, oh, I know I need to be better at telling my story, right? That's the impetus for them saying, let me talk to a story coach versus a career coach or a life coach, right? I need to be better about telling my story. And for them, it's like, oh, I maybe need to be better about telling my story on LinkedIn or telling my story in a job interview or
hmm
to my boss or whatever. And I'm like, yes, we will get there. That is part of it. But the problem is before you can confidently share your story out with the world, you really need to believe it. And I think
mm,
that's the part that people forget that storytelling is like I said, how we make meaning of the world. And we get so stuck in stories. I do it as a story coach, as someone who's very conscious of it. The world does it, right? Like we live in a society or in cultures or in families that keep us stuck in stories. And part of this work is when we take this pause to look inward, to look backward at where we've been, we can start asking ourselves, like, is that story true? There might be some parts of it that are true, but is that the
Mm-hmm.
story that is my story, right? And have I been stuck in someone else's story? Have I just been a sidekick character in this story? Or am I really the main character in this story? And what's so empowering is when you understand that you are the author of your own life. No one else can tell you what your life is about but you. And in doing this deep story work, you can start to say, hey, I've been through some tough stuff in my life. It was not easy, it was not hard. But here are the moments where I gained resilience. Here are the moments that were my low points that I could only go up from there, right? And when we choose to say, I actually, that story that for so long I've been telling myself is a contamination story. It started good, it ended bad. I can now see because you've given yourself that space to reflect. Yeah. That story started in a bad place, but then look how much good has come from that work, right? That I've
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that's one of the powerful tools of this personal storytelling is it starts from a place of like, oh, I just need to be better at LinkedIn. And then all of a sudden we have this incredible personal transformation and confidence building and connection and growth that comes from taking the time to explore our own experiences with a slightly more open and compassionate lens to see ourselves. And then once we do
Mm-hmm.
that, we can look around and say, what story am I in right now? We're all in a story, right? Like one of the things I always say is someday this will be a long time ago. Someday we will look back at this day in June 2025 when we're recording and be like, oh my God, who was I back then? Look at how much I've grown.
Yeah.
And when we recognize that, then we can say, what kind of story do I want it to be as I think forward into the future? What kind of story do I want to be living? And that
Mm-hmm.
gives us back so much agency and control in our life, even when there's outside scenarios hitting, and causing chaos, right? Like we can still choose how we are going to be going through this next chapter of our life.
Yeah. And I love that, when we're
Mhm.
talking about how we decide to shape our
Mhm.
life, because I think that a lot of us, and I did this for a really long time, we forget that we are the author of our story. So we get
Mhm.
stuck in the day to day and the things that are going on. And then we're like, it won't change. Why won't this work? Why
Mhm.
doesn't this, when ultimately we do have that choice. And what I think is really interesting and something that I started doing a little while ago was when I was reflecting on my stories and like where I had come from, one of the things that I really enjoy doing is also imagining what it would look like in the future, right?
Mhm.
How do I want it crafted? How do I want to be? What
Mhm.
stages do I want to be on? Who do I want to
Mhm.
communicate with? Who do I want? How do I want people to feel while we're
Mhm.
having those conversations? And what's really cool about it is you're also using visualization tactics, right?
Mhm.
Which is really great for the brain. So FYI for anybody that's listening,
Mhm.
they say that visualization is the same as actually doing it. Like the brain cannot
Mhm.
tell the difference. And it really is true. And I thought this was a really interesting learning experience where if you really can connect to this is what I want to be doing, right? Or this is where I want to be going, and you can attach a feeling to it, just like you attach feelings to the stories of things that have happened,
Mhm.
how easier it is to notice when that comes about or to kind of go toward it
Yep.
a lot faster because it almost becomes more of a what's the word I'm looking for? A normal to the brain,
Yeah,
right? So it's not as
absolutely.
scary. It's not as
Mhm.
like, what is this? There isn't as
Mhm.
much questioning of it because you've
Mhm.
already created a space in the body so that when you
Mhm.
get to it, it's like, oh, okay, well,
Here we go.
here we go with this one,
Yeah,
right?
here we go. Yeah, there's so many great things in there, Kat, that I want to just pull out. So, yes, you're so right. Like, stories create real emotion, whether the story is true or false, right? Like, you've probably seen a Pixar movie. If you're like me, I cry at almost every Pixar movie, right? And it's because Pixar is so good at playing on the emotions that they know that these stories are going to elicit. But I know
Mm-hmm.
for me, like when we get stuck in these stories, they can create real emotion. I know in my past, when I've had, like, for example, a crush on someone, I will play out these elaborate stories in my head about how they're going to confess their undying love to me and we're going to have this incredible relationship. But the problem was they were fictional versions of real people playing out this fictional story in my head. But that created real emotion and then
Mm-hmm.
disappointment when that very detailed vision of the future with my like fictional boyfriend didn't come to pass, right? And I know that
Yeah.
with storytelling, it's so tempting to say, I want to end in X spot, and that looks exactly like ABC thing. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really helpful and sometimes to get really clear on where we want to be going. But I also sort of caution against getting so hung up on one outcome. One outcome that is like the best possible outcome, the only outcome that you're going towards. Because in this like future storytelling, we need to create a compass for ourselves to get where we want to be going. And I talk a lot about this with my clients, the difference between having a destination and a direction. And we live in
Mm.
this very destination society that says,
Yeah.
I need to have my life look like X by X time. So that's like, I need to have this job title or this salary or be married and have a white picket fence, right? Like, so we set our sights on these very specific end goals that are completely achievable. We can, in fact, achieve them. But the problem is the path that we give ourselves to achieve them becomes narrower because we've set the endpoint already. And so
Mm.
when inevitably life lifes and we end up just to the side of where we set out, that's still a very good outcome.
Mm.
It can often feel like failure, and that can
Yeah.
feel really hard. But what I like to think about with story is what instead is the direction that I want to go in my life. And the direction is a lot more flexible. And that says, I want to go northeast in my life. And northeast looks like being shaped by these values, being shaped by this thing that I know I'm passionate about, but I don't quite know how that's going to come to fruition yet. Being
Mm-hmm.
shaped by, I know I don't want to go southwest because that looks like more toxicity or bad relationships or jobs that suck my soul, you know? And so it gives us space to explore and to be curious and to let new things emerge that we couldn't possibly even imagine right now where we are, but know that we are still aligned in how we want to move forward. So when I talk about proactive or future storytelling, we might do a visualization. I call them a time travel meditation, where I literally walk my clients through a full day of their life from the moment their eyes blink open on their pillow, and I have them look around their room, their bedroom, and say, is there anyone here? A people or pets? Like, what kind of light is in your bedroom? Like, how cozy is your bed, right? Walking them through their morning, their noon, their night, all the way to their head hits the pillow again. And I know for a lot of my clients, some of them can see this day very vividly, and it helps them understand, well, like, oh, I certainly don't want to be in this toxic job that I'm currently in. I'd rather be working with these kinds of people.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of them, they can't necessarily picture the details of that day. But what they can, to your point, what they can picture is how they want to feel during
Mm.
that day, how they want to feel lit up, or the types of people or problems they want to be working with. And that is perfectly valid, incredible information to go with, because from that information, we can build that directional story compass that helps them make aligned choices as they move forward.
Ooh, I love the direction versus the
Mhm.
destination.
Mhm.
Like that is super. Write that down. Everybody write that
Yeah,
down. Everyone's literally write that down. Because
powerful.
you're right, we do. We get stuck
Hmm.
in the space that we're supposed to be in, like you said, at certain times, at certain ages, and all the
Hmm.
things. And then, like you said, when life lifes,
Hmm.
things shift or you end up growing out of the goals that you originally set. And if that happens, you continuing to push for a goal that doesn't align with you anymore is going to burn you out, is going to put you in a state of depression, is going to put
Hmm.
you into a state of feeling like you failed when inevitably what it actually means is it just doesn't align with you anymore. That
Yeah.
was a super hard lesson for me. like a
Yeah.
super hard lesson
Yeah.
for me to realize, especially, when I came out of my abusive relationship, like, yes, it was wonderful to be in like this world that I didn't know what was going to happen. But at the same time, I immediately started putting pressure on myself because now
Mhm.
I have two kids by two different people,
Yeah.
one who's a complete trash,
Mhm.
the other one who
Yeah.
doesn't even exist, right? And
Right.
now I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, how do I fill the hole? How do I
Mhm.
make sure that my kids have a dad in their life? Because, that's
Mhm.
what parenting and a
Mhm.
family is supposed to be. So you have, like you
Mhm.
were saying earlier, right? We are in somebody else's story,
Mhm.
usually created by society, people.
Yep.
But
Thank you, patriarchy. Thank you, capitalism.
and
Yeah.
then we wonder why we feel like no matter
Mhm.
what we're doing, we are not doing things right. I
Mhm.
mean, I felt like for a really long time in my life
Mhm.
after leaving that situation that I was constantly making up for the things that we never got to do. And so I
Mhm.
lived in that state with my children for a while. Now, did we get to do some really awesome things? Yes. We were
Yeah.
always hiking or enjoying nature or doing something like that. And it also kept me, like you said, in a narrow pathway where it was like, okay, I have to stay at this job because I have to make this amount of money because we
Mhm.
have to be able to do this. And that kept me in a job that
Mhm.
sucked for quite a
Yeah.
long time. And then when I was forced out of that and took the leap,
Mhm.
well, one, that's scary as hell to begin with. But
Sure.
at the same time, like you said, there were so many more opportunities. And that was probably about
Mhm.
the time that I realized, okay, if we're going to take the leap to get into,
Mhm.
which I chose real estate at that time,
Mhm.
to get into real
Mhm.
estate, what is it that I enjoy doing? What did I enjoy doing from the other job? How can we get more of that? And how
Yep.
can we get less of the things that I don't enjoy? And that was
Yep.
probably the first time that I stopped focusing on the destination, which didn't even realize
Mhm.
that's what I was doing. Look at me. But
Yeah,
I
there you
was
go.
focusing. I was focusing on the direction that I wanted to go. Like, how do
Yeah.
I want to feel? And I am that person. When you were talking about your people that visualize. I can
Mhm.
give you visual clues and I can give you certain things, but like if you ask me to go to like the ninth degree of detail, I'm probably not going to be able to do it. However, if I am looking for an emotion, if I'm looking for a
Mhm.
feeling that I am wanting to have or I want others to get from me, like especially when I'm
Mhm.
doing my speeches, I can very
Mhm.
vividly feel that in my body. Like
Mhm.
that's very easy for me. But where a lot of people used to tell me, right, like you just visualize all the things. I'm like,
Mhm.
I just can't pick all of that out. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you saying that, right? Like that's totally fine. That's how you operate. And then there's other people that operate in this zone because again, we get stuck in this story of, but
Mhm.
this is how they did it and I'm not doing it
Yeah.
right. So therefore, and leaving this space open to where you ultimately, I feel like you get to enjoy life a
Yeah.
lot more
Mhm.
because you aren't so hyper focused on one specific thing. And not saying that goals aren't a good thing to have. I still have goals,
Yeah.
of my own and stuff like that. And the space to see how I get to that goal or
Mhm.
also being open to, ooh, that goal looks
Mhm.
better.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to share the story actually of my layoff because I think it really applies to what you just said, right? Like, so for 15 years, I was a destination kid, right? Like I was on this track of being a producer, of moving up the ranks, and I was very focused on what was the next promotion, what was my title. I was like very defined by my job at the time. I was a global creative lead at Airbnb, and like, what a dream job in so many ways. Airbnb was an amazing company to work for. I was there at a very special time. I worked with incredible people. I got to travel the world on Airbnb's dime. Like, what amazing. And I was obsessed with that job to the point where it was my everything. Like,
Mm,
truly, I moved to San Francisco. I had no friends, so work became all that I did. It was the first thing that I told people about when I moved. And for like many years, right? Until the pandemic and I got laid off. And I vividly remember the day that I got laid off. It was Cinco de Mayo 2020. Woke up to this email saying there was an emergency all hands. Everyone had to attend. That's when Brian Chesky announced that they were downsizing the company. And if you got an email from your manager setting up a meeting, that means you were one of the people impacted. And so I looked at my
mm,
calendar and there it was later that afternoon with my manager. And I was like, holy crap, like my life has just changed completely. Not out of because I chose it, but because the
hmm
universe has just put this in my path. And I remember walking to a local park. masked because it was peak COVID and there were like kids playing on the playground, just so happy and carefree. And I sat under this tree and I just sobbed. And I sobbed and I sobbed because I was like, what's next? Right?
Mm.
It was now all of a sudden I'd gone from having a general sense of a plan for my life and a path that I was going to follow to now a wide open space. And I know for so many of my clients, they feel that too. There's like a million possible paths that they could take when they're at this, what I call a turn the page moment. And sitting under that tree, sobbing, I realized I was in a story that, like, I would look back at that moment and tell the story of that moment. Here I am, 5 years later, telling the story of that moment. And I got to choose what kind of story I wanted it to be. Did I want it to be a story of another time that I just sort of sat around and waited for an opportunity to present itself to me, which is sort of how my career had been shaped up until that point? Or did I want it to be a story of a time I got intentional? Now, in that moment, I had no idea what that was going to look like, which was
Yeah.
scary coming from a place in society that tells us we have to have it all figured out, right? And then we have to go pursue that thing. But
Hmm.
instead, what I told myself was, this is a story of the time I lost my job, but it's going to be a story about the time I find myself. And in setting that intention for myself, it's a time I'm going to find myself. It was directional enough, but also broad enough that it allowed me some space, A, to stop cold applying to jobs that I knew I didn't want or that I wasn't qualified for or that was not the thing that I love to do. And it allowed me some space to like actually go inward and do exactly the exercise that you talked about. I call it moments of magic, moments that suck. Like, what were the high points? What were the low points of my career? And when I did that, holy moly, it was so obvious once I did that exercise. The high points all related to creating space for people to share their stories to create greater impact in this world. And all of the low points revolved around me getting way too sucked in and like emotionally connected to some like workplace political BS, right? And that just the more and more space and time that I gave myself to explore my story, my own wisdom, get curious about other people's experience of doing things differently and building community and hearing all of these great stories from other people, it allowed me to overcome this limiting belief, this negative narrative that I had, that it was not possible for me to make the kind of living I wanted to make working for myself, right? Or that
Mm.
I couldn't possibly figure out how to be an entrepreneur. That was a limiting belief that I had. And the more and more that I looked into my own stories, I had been entrepreneurial throughout my career, right? I had started every job I had ever done. I was the first person in that role and created it. And so the more work that I did looking back at my stories, the more confidence I got to get clear on the path that I wanted to choose. And then this is now an exercise that I actually do with all of my clients. When we start, I call it your life chapter map. It's a really, really intense worksheet, but it's powerful where you look back across your entire life, or you pick a chapter of your life if your entire life feels like too much, and you say, what were the high points? What were the low points? What were just the facts? And
Hmm.
see what emerges when you give yourself the space to actually map out where you've been so you can get clear on where you are. And most importantly, then really set an intentional path for where you want to go next.
Oh, well, and thank you for sharing that too.
Mhm,
Your story.
mhm,
I know that one, so many people are going to
mhm,
relate to this, especially with the pandemic, because I know that the pandemic
mhm,
shifted so many people in so many areas or in
mhm,
their jobs or in their home life and all these things. What I think is really beautiful about you sharing that story is you chose how you wanted to perceive that story and how you
mhm.
plan to tell it in the future. So many times we have bad
Of
situations like what I went through, and it
course.
just becomes that sad story that you
Mhm,
share, right? And at the same time, you can put a spin on it,
mhm,
right? You can choose to have the perspective. Now, everybody's going to have their own perspective of how they see your story when you share it. Now, you can't, I can't
mhm,
hold anybody to that, but I do think that it also helps us see more of the positive or the
mhm,
things that we should be looking for
mhm.
versus so focused on like this time of my life sucked, right? I
Yeah.
mean, there's so many things that I could go back to and
Mhm.
say, I remember when this happened and I remember when this happened, and I could focus on that, which ends up
Mhm.
dragging you down, right?
Mhm.
Or I can say, there were multiple things that
Mhm.
shouldn't have been the way that they were. However, because of those things, I
Mhm.
am now where I'm at today. My boys are now where they're at today, right?
Mhm.
It's it's this perspective shifting that I don't think that we think about
Mhm.
enough,
Yeah.
because we tell the story one time, we had
Mhm.
whatever what emotion was attached to it originally, and
Mhm.
then we stay within that emotion. And then every time that you share it, it kind of becomes that emotion, and other people kind of get drug into it,
Mhm.
right? Like we were talking about
Mhm.
storytelling, people get drug into that emotion.
Mhm.
And then you get people like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," or "Oh, that must have been horrible." I don't want anyone to say that. When I share my story and I talk about things, I want them to ask questions like, well, how do you feel now? Or how does your family
Mhm.
feel about it now? Or what do your
Yeah.
boys think about? I want them to ask the questions to get them curious about, okay, she's been through this, she's made it, and now
Mhm.
we're moving in this direction. What is it now? Not go back
Yeah.
and say, well, I'm so sorry that that happened to you. Do you
Mhm.
think if I want people to see it in a different light,
Mhm.
because yes, there is darkness
Mhm.
in a lot of things that we're sharing, and at the same time, there are so many lessons out of it
Mhm.
if you choose to
Right?
see the lessons within it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the main storytelling tools I teach my clients is I call it your story foundation sentence. Now, you may never actually use this sentence in the story that you're telling, but it helps you pull out these lessons and make it relevant to your audience. And the sentence goes like this: It's a story about the action of the story, the people, the scenes, the stakes, what happened. But it's really about what is the emotion of the story, the change that you want to share, or the lesson that came out of that experience. And
Mm,
you should care because what is going to be relevant to your audience and what do you want them to take away? And then what do you want them to do once you've heard this story? And that can often be implicit or explicit. Like literally after you go do this, go to lizmorrison.com/40, the spelled out, and get the life chapters map. Or it could be implicit, like you are not alone, right? Like other people have been through similar things and have gotten through it. So know that you have the power within you to get through it too. So it's a story about, but it's really about, and you should care because, right? And it sounds like, Kat, what you've done in your reflection in going back through the experiences you've had is you didn't just stay stuck in the it's a story about, right? The things that were hard, just going back through and rehashing. You were able to find that key emotion, the lesson, the importance of what that experience taught you. And now look at the beautiful gift that you're giving the world by sharing it so openly on this podcast. I know you do incredible speaking and you bring it in through workshops. And like, again, what an incredible gift that you give because you never know who needs to hear that story. And you are so beautifully inspiring your audience to look differently at their challenging experiences too, to be able to reframe that as resilience and growth versus like just pulling you down and being the victim and staying stuck.
Oh, thank you, Liz. I appreciate that. And I do, I love that you're teaching people how to shift a perspective in a story that you have already lived, and have
Mhm.
the ability to incorporate it in anywhere in your life,
Yeah.
right? Whether it is in your job, in your business, in your home, the way that you are asking people to
Mhm.
take a look at their own stories is
Mhm.
incorporating a lot of reflection that I feel like we desperately need when it comes to all the things that we are constantly getting hit with from every
Yeah.
angle all the time. And even, when you were talking about in this story and you care because I also think that you can shift that inward to
Mhm.
write out your own stories and then make a decision on how that story impacted you, and then
Mhm.
why do you specifically care about it, so that you can
Yeah.
make the decision on, is this a story I want to continue telling?
Mhm.
Or now that I've
Mhm.
reflected on it on myself, I realize that all this is going to do is
Mhm.
create blah, right?
Yeah,
And I'm
exactly.
choosing that this isn't a story that I want to share. Because there are some things, I mean, there are things with
Mhm.
things that I went through that I don't share within my
Mhm.
stories because I
Yeah.
know that if I do, it takes me to a different place.
Mhm.
And I'm either not ready right now to get out of that, or I may never be ready to get out of
Yeah.
that space. So I choose to share the other
Mhm.
pieces and components for that. And I think
Yeah.
that the ultimate overview of this topic of conversation
Mhm.
is being able to be aware of the stories that you are telling,
Mhm.
know why, know the emotions that you want, either for your audience or for yourself, and then
Yeah.
choosing the perspective that you want to have as you are
Mhm.
eliciting that to other people. And I think this is just, it's a beautiful way to get us out of in front of the social
Mhm.
media and all of
Yeah.
the political crap and all the things that are around us and come back to what we have always done, like you said, which is telling stories, reflecting on who we are, going inward, and
Mhm.
getting out of all of the noise that is constantly
Mhm. Mhm.
bombarding us all the
100%.
time.
Yeah, and I'd say it is by design right now in this world that we are experiencing that to create division using really powerful, emotionally manipulative storytelling. Whether people are doing that consciously or unconsciously, it is, right? And so we can get really stuck in these us versus them silos that
Hmm.
keep our empathy and compassion down for other people. And, again, this is why we as a species have thrived, is because we are storytelling creatures and we can use stories to build those bridges, to build that empathy and connection. And for me, I know, again, one of the main questions I get asked when people come to me is like, I'm boring. I have no stories. Where do I even start with
Oh,
thinking about
yes.
what stories to tell? And I'll say, A, you have incredible stories. Every single person on this planet has a story that can and will change the world if they so choose to use it that way. I believe that deeply with every ounce of my body. But really, it's like, what are the stories that we can find that create that immediate connection with our audience? And for me, I call those human level stories. They're stories that touch on something that is universal, that everyone understands, can relate to, experiences in some way, but is also unique, that every person has a unique experience and perspective on, so that, we can connect. Like, for example, I just had my 40th birthday, which was so phenomenal and special. And as part of my birthday celebrations, I host an event here in the San Francisco Bay Area called Storytime, which is where I bring people together around these human level themes and create space for small group conversations using design story prompts that get people pulling out these memories and turning them into momentum and really juicy things to create connection. And so the theme was birthdays because literally every single person on this planet has a birthday. And so that's very universal, but then everyone has such a unique experience of how, I mean, even we were just chatting off camera about birthdays and sort of how we've celebrated over the years. And that's just one example of a human level theme that can it can help you pull out memories from your past that might have clues for you or wisdom to share for you. And it creates an immediate connection when we share those stories with each other. And so the general sort of buckets that I put human level stories in, and they alliterate because I love to alliterate, is sort of like family, anything that touches on actual family, belonging, home, friendship, right? That it sort of falls into the
Yeah.
family bucket. Food. Anytime we can talk about food, everyone needs to eat. And so food is such a universal thing to create immediate connection with people. Firsts, first times, first names, favorites, feelings that can be actual like sensation feelings, that time you were the most cold or the most hot, or emotions or feelings like pride or fear or any of those things. Failure, probably one of the best, if not the best category to share stories about, because everyone makes mistakes, everyone fails. And when we
Yeah.
can share stories of how we've overcome them is so important. And then lastly, future. What is the future you most desire? When you were younger, what did you want to be when you grew up? Where did that land? Or what is the future that you want now, right? What is that vision story that we can all be gathering around? Because every person in this world, hopefully, wants to live into the future. And so that means that they want something. So when we can use those general umbrella categories to help us find these experiences from our past, it can help us really get clear on how we're going to create connection in this moment. And most importantly, move forward in a way that feels aligned.
Oh, I love it. And that makes so much sense. I love the prompts. Like that's such an awesome
Mhm.
idea because I do think that, we get stuck in our head and we hear other people tell like these big, amazing, crazy
Yeah.
stories. And then we're like, I don't have any
Hmm.
of that. It was the same thing with me for a really long time because I'm like, well,
Hmm.
I mean, yeah, but there's people that's been in an abusive situation that's been a lot
Hmm.
worse. And I actually
Sure.
I had someone that was like, please don't say that because everybody's story is their own story and there is no comparison. Like you're not on a
Right?
level depending on
Yeah.
what somebody else has been through. Your story is your story and it's just as important as somebody else's. And that was kind of the catalyst for me to be like, all right, I need to be sharing this more because people were
Yeah.
able to relate to it. So now, before we give all of your information, because I want everyone to know where they connect with you. Is there anything you would like to leave the audience with?
Yes, I am just so I encourage everyone this week to find a friend, a family member, a stranger in the line at Starbucks, and ask them a story-based question prompt. Ask yourself if it's you with your journal, just like carve some intentional time this week to explore your story. And, one of my favorite easy story prompts is like, what was your very first paying job? And what's something you learned from that job that you still use today? That
Ooh.
amazingly always gets started. Another really fun story prompt is like, what is your go-to comfort food, especially when you're sick? And who made that for you for the first time? Or like, why is that the thing that you constantly go towards? Just questions like that, right? I'm a big fan of having follow-up questions. So it's like, start with one question that sparks an idea, but then ask a follow-up that brings it deeper and uncovers that emotion or that lesson that you want to share. So just do that with your friends or family or the cutie in line at Starbucks. Like, ask a story-based prompt and just see how you feel when you start exploring your own stories using this much more intentional lens. And I would love to hear how it goes. You can tag me. I don't know if we're going to go into the social now, but
Yes,
like,
go ahead.
I,
Tell everybody
okay,
where they
like
can find you.
I would love, love, love to hear how this goes. You can reach me at my website, lizmorrison.com. If you are interested, on lizmorrison.com, I actually have a few free story worksheets that you can download to start, whether you're looking at your career stories or your full life story or the pandemic stories. I just did a worksheet all around what has the pandemic taught us 5 years later. So if you go to lizmorrison.com/40, FORTY spelled out, that's where you can download my life chapters map worksheet. And that, again, it's a big worksheet. It takes a couple of weeks, honestly, to do it because you need to carve out time. But it is so powerful to even just start with some of the initial prompts on that worksheet to pull out meaningful moments from your life that you can use. I call it narrative navigation, right? That you can use to help shape your path forward. And it's just so powerful and it's fun, hopefully. I mean, it might be challenging to like remember some of these challenging times, but to your point earlier, Kat, like when we give ourselves the space to look back at these challenging moments, we build so much resilience and confidence and compassion for ourselves and for other people. And it just helps us understand how far we've come and get ready for how far we want to keep going.
Oh, I love it. Yes. And to everybody out there that's listening, don't worry. We'll put all the information in the show
Yes,
notes so you'll
yes.
be able to connect with Liz. Super easy. We'll make sure we have the
Uh-huh.
link for her freebie as well. I love the prompt ideas. I think that's an
Mm.
amazing tool and idea. And I know that I used similar things when I was going back through, why things were upsetting me or why things were bothering me and just asking myself some of the most random questions, but things you would ask other people, right? So I think it's very important for us to take the time to reflect and make space, like you said, for us to be intentional with it. So thank you so much, Liz, for
Course.
being a
I'm
part of the
so happy to be
podcast.
here. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And I hope everyone out there just knows you have a story that can change the world. So go find it, shape it, and share it.
Yes. And to
Yes.
everybody else out there, I hope that you are now starting to see that storytelling really is just a component of who we are as human beings. And it doesn't matter if it's in your job, if it's something you do on a day to day, storytelling is just a part of who we are. If you have children, you're constantly telling them stories, you're sharing things from your past. Just remember to also take a moment to look into those stories and really go deep to see what were the lessons and the patterns that we were in. Are we still in those today? And what direction are we wanting to move into the future? So until next time, do one thing positive for someone each and every day and see the difference that it makes in your life. Catch you later. Thank you so much for tuning in to Real Chat with Kat today, where real stories meet real solutions. If you loved today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review on Apple, and share this with someone who may also need to hear this as well. Let's also keep the conversation going. Follow me on socials at The Lotus Effect, connect with our incredible guests, and remember, you are never alone. Your story matters, and you have the ability and the power to rewrite it. You always have a choice. Until next time, stay strong, stay inspired, and keep showing up as the incredible, unstoppable